You've seen it happen to other people. Someone you know falls in love and suddenly they're unrecognizable. The music they listen to changes. The way they spend their time changes. The things they care about shift. The person they are in conversation feels different, lighter, more open, more alive in a way they weren't before. And then it happens to you. And from the inside, it doesn't feel like change. It feels like arrival. Like a version of yourself you didn't know existed has suddenly been given permission to come forward. You're more patient than you thought you were, more generous than your daily life usually requires, more willing to be vulnerable than you've allowed yourself to be in years. You do things you wouldn't normally do, say things you wouldn't normally say, care about things you previously dismissed entirely. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, you look at yourself and think, who is this person? Is this actually me? Or is love doing something to me that I should be more suspicious of? The answer is both. And understanding exactly what's happening is one of the most fascinating things psychology and neuroscience have ever uncovered about the human experience. The first thing that happens when you fall in love is that your brain undergoes a chemical transformation that is, by every clinical measure, indistinguishable from a temporary neurological disorder. This is not a metaphor. Researchers studying the brains of people who had recently fallen in love found activity patterns that matched, almost exactly, the brain patterns of people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The intrusive thoughts, the inability to focus on anything else, the constant return to a single subject regardless of what else is happening around you. That's not romance in the poetic sense. That's your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, critical evaluation, and measured judgment, being partially suppressed by a flood of neurochemicals that your brain releases specifically in response to new romantic attachment. Dopamine surges, making everything feel more vivid and rewarding. Norepinephrine spikes, creating the racing heart, the heightened alertness, the feeling that something significant is happening. And serotonin, the chemical most associated with emotional stability and contentment, actually drops, which is why love in its early stages doesn't feel like contentment at all. It feels like beautiful instability, like standing on ground that moves in a way you don't want to stop. Your brain is not making you irrational because something is wrong. It's making you irrational because it has identified something it considers extraordinarily important, and it is redirecting every available resource toward it. The second reason you become a different person is something that goes deeper than chemistry. When someone sees you in a particular way, when they reflect back a version of you that is warmer, more interesting, more worthy of love than the version you carry around on a daily basis, you start to inhabit that version. Not because you're performing for them, but because human identity is far more fluid and relational than most people realize. You are not a fixed self that exists independently of the people around you. You are partly a self that gets called forward by the specific people in your life. And when someone looks at you with genuine love and attention, they activate parts of you that ordinary life never touches. The generosity that doesn't get expressed because daily life rarely asks for it. The tenderness that stays dormant because most interactions don't create space for it. The curiosity, the playfulness, the willingness to be known completely. These aren't performances of a self you're not. They are genuine dimensions of who you are that most of your life simply doesn't activate. Love activates them. And the person who emerges when those dimensions are running isn't a false version of you. It might actually be one of the truest versions of you that exists. The third reason is about what love does to your sense of self at the most fundamental level. Psychologists have a term for what happens to personal identity in the early stages of romantic love. They call it self-expansion. When you fall in love, your sense of self literally expands to include another person. Their interests become interesting to you. Their world becomes relevant to your world. The things they care about create new neural pathways in your brain as you absorb them. You are, in a measurable and neurological sense, becoming larger. Your identity is incorporating new dimensions that didn't exist before, which is why the music changes, and the books change, and the way you spend a Sunday morning changes. It's not that you're abandoning who you are. It's that who you are is temporarily growing to include someone else's entire world. And that growth feels, from the inside, like becoming more alive, like the edges of yourself extending further than they usually reach. The fourth reason is the one that explains why this transformation eventually faces its hardest tests. The person you become when you fall in love is real, that it requires conditions to survive. It requires the presence of the other person. It requires the feeling of being seen and chosen and loved back. And when those conditions change, when the relationship settles, or struggles, or ends, some of those activated dimensions go quiet again, and you're left with a question that nobody warns you about. Not just do I still love this person, but do I still get to be this version of myself? Because some of the most painful breakups aren't just the loss of another person, they're the loss of who you were when you were with them, the version of yourself that existed inside that relationship, the one that was warmer, braver, more open, more alive than the one that shows up for ordinary life. And that loss, the loss of a self rather than just a person, is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can go through. Here's what all of this means. The person you become when you fall in love is not a fantasy. It's not a performance or an illusion or a version of yourself that disappears the moment the feeling fades. It's a genuine dimension of who you are that got called forward by something powerful enough to reach it. The real question isn't whether that person is real. The real question is why ordinary life so rarely creates the conditions for them to exist, and whether you need to wait for love to arrive before you let them out. So ask yourself this: the person you became the last time you fell in love, what would it take to let that version of yourself exist without needing someone else to call them forward first?